SMU Political Science Professor Matthew Wilson, thank you so much for joining us. To bring everybody up to speed on this, there is a political standoff going on at the Texas Capitol right now. We know we're in a special session, but even before the special session, there were sharp disagreements between the House and the Senate over how to provide property tax relief. The session ends, no bill passed, and so the governor calls a special session. And then the House passes a bill that the governor had requested. The Senate passes a totally different version. And so then the governor sides with the House, and now we have this political standoff. And so what do you make of this?
Well, it's pretty remarkable that the Republican leadership in the governor's office, the House, and the Senate did not have their ducks in a row going into this session, didn't know how things were going to play out, because clearly this is not the outcome that anyone would have desired or anticipated. The irony here is that everybody wants to provide substantial property tax relief. There's no disagreement about that. Everybody wants to spend about the same amount of money in providing substantial property tax relief. The debate is over how to do that, by what mechanism to provide that relief. And the real point of contention is whether property tax relief should be entirely focused on homeowners or whether a substantial portion should be going to businesses and landlords. And the Senate version focuses entirely on homeowners. The House version that the governor has now come out behind has a substantial portion of the relief going to businesses and to landlords. And that's where this dispute is right now. But one would have thought that those disagreements could have been worked out before we got to this impasse.
Well, I mean, in statements last night, after the governor issues a statement saying that he sides with the House because they passed the bill that reflects his plan, the lieutenant governor came out and said, basically saying that the governor may be misinformed about the roles between the executive and the legislative branches. That's an insult, isn't it?
It absolutely is. And it reflects the fact that the lieutenant governor is very angry that he was essentially cut out of these negotiations. It's pretty clear that the governor and the Speaker of the House reached an agreement on something that was satisfactory to both of them without a lot of input from the Senate. And therefore, they went ahead to pass that under a very narrow session call that the governor issued, essentially directing the chambers on how to go about providing property tax relief. And the Senate is crying foul. And there has always been some simmering tension between the governor and the lieutenant governor. They represent different elements of the Republican base. They represent somewhat different visions of the Texas Republican Party. And that is coming to the surface now in the disagreement over this property tax bill.
And my question is, because the governor came up with his own plan because the House and the Senate could not come up with anything that they could agree on during the regular legislative session. The House really emphasizing capping property tax appraisals, and the Senate really focused on homestead exemptions. The House passed a bill trying to do both, and the Senate wouldn't go for that. And so is it fair for the governor to say, look, I gave you guys 4 months, 5 months to figure this out. I let you handle it. You couldn't. So I'm coming in with my own plan. Isn't that a fair thing?
Well, the governor can certainly make a case for his plan. The question constitutionally and legally is how narrowly can the governor reasonably draw the mandate for a special legislative session? Because the state legislature can only consider measures that the governor has specifically called them into session to consider. That being said, the governor cannot just write a bill and hand it to the legislature and say, pass this or not. That's too narrow a call for a legislative session. So the legal constitutional debate right now between the lieutenant governor and the governor is how narrowly can those boundaries be drawn about what approach can be taken to addressing the governor's broader priority of property taxes. But you're right. The House and the Senate were at odds over this during the entire legislative session. And what the governor's plan does is to say, okay, we're not going to do anything on appraisal caps. We're not going to do anything on homestead exemption. We're going to focus entirely on the issue of compression, that is giving money to school districts so that they can lower the rates. And he sees that as a simple, clean approach that splits the difference essentially between the House and Senate approaches. And he just wanted everybody to get on board with that quickly, get this passed and over with. But it's clear that Dan Patrick is really committed to this increase in homestead exemptions. And that's what's creating the impasse right now.
Yeah, and he actually said as much earlier in the day, saying he's like, I may be the last person standing and I will be the last person standing on this. He said he's not going to back down from this. And so how do you see this playing out? Because at some point it does have to get resolved, right? Because if not, isn't this too big of an issue? The governor, lieutenant governor, everybody, Republicans, Democrats, they favor this. They want some kind of property tax relief. They've all promised it. So how does this get resolved?
Well, this is a couple of questions here. First of all, is whether Dan Patrick can unilaterally command the state Senate. And largely he has been able to do that. So question is, would there be senators that would break with Patrick, just enough Republicans to join with the Democrats and pass the governor's bill? That's one possibility. I think that is unlikely because Patrick wields a lot of influence over the Republican caucus in the Senate. So if just enough Republicans joined with Senate Democrats to get a majority and pass the bill, that would be one way out of this. Another way out of this would be essentially, it would have to be another special session called. But this is really a game of chicken right now. Everybody wants property tax relief. The failure of a property tax relief measure would be the worst case scenario for the governor and the lieutenant governor and the Speaker of the House. Just like an actual collision when you're playing chicken is the worst outcome for everybody. The question is, who at the end of the day is so afraid of the worst outcome that they're willing to give in on what they see as the best outcome? And that's what Dade Phelan and Governor Abbott are trying to pressure Patrick into doing. We'll see if it works.
And yesterday, during his remarks before the Texas Public Policy Foundation, Lieutenant Governor really criticized Dade Phelan in a memorable quote. He said, Dade is a challenge. And he said, we're all three Republicans. It should be easy. I shouldn't have to take Tylenol 3 times a day. What'd you make of that?
I mean, he's just saying publicly what we've all seen happen for a while on a variety of issues. The House and the Senate, and therefore the Speaker Phelan and Lieutenant Governor Patrick, have been at odds in this legislative session. They've been at odds over property taxes. They've been at odds over school choice. They've been at odds over sports betting. They've been at odds over some of the range of culture war issues. They have different approaches to governance. And it's pretty clear that Dan Patrick represents the populist movement element within the Republican Party to a significant degree. And Dade Phelan represents the Chamber of Commerce business element within the Republican Party to a significant degree. And sometimes those groups agree, but sometimes they have different priorities. And that's clearly what's coming to the fore in this legislative session.
And I'm wondering what you think that a lot of this, the insults, the statements, this has all been playing out on Twitter. Even before the regular legislative session ended on Monday, this was playing out on Twitter. What do you make of that?
Well, we know that social media dials up the temperature on all kinds of disputes and conflicts through our society writ large, and this is no exception. People are playing not only the insider game in Austin, but also they're playing to the court of public opinion, and social media is one major way that they do that. Republicans typically have not been quite as active on Twitter as Democrats have been in the past. But we're starting to see that change somewhat, and we're starting to see, these legislative leaders try to make their case to the public using social media, using Twitter. I think that's going to be an important part of this going forward, because the reality here is that the governor and the Speaker of the House have a fairly strong legal and institutional position But I think that the lieutenant governor has a pretty strong position in the court of public opinion. And therefore, the incentive for him is to go public with this, to try to make his case on Twitter, to try to make his case in public speeches, to try to make his case to the public saying, I'm standing up for homeowners. These other guys are trying to give away a lot of this money to businesses. And I think that's a pretty powerful populist appeal that Dan Patrick can make on this.
So who's winning and who's losing?
Well, I mean, right now, it appears that the governor is in the strongest position because he's the one that has the authority to call special sessions and to determine the parameters of the special session. And the lieutenant governor cannot unilaterally do that. The question is, at the end of the day, would the lieutenant governor and would the state senate be willing to scuttle property tax relief in its entirety in order to make a point and in order to spite the governor? That would be remarkable, and that would be actually sad for the whole state and for all parties involved if that happens. But the lieutenant governor doesn't have a lot of weapons at his disposal in this debate, short of that, what we might call nuclear option. So it really is a difficult spot to be in.
Earlier in the session, during the regular session, the lieutenant governor held a news conference on property taxes. And he said of Speaker Phelan, you got to know when to fold your cards. Could that statement come back and bite him?
I think it could. I think that's what the governor would tell him right now, in that the governor has essentially decided to, in his view, split the difference between the House approach and the Senate approach. And he said, look, we couldn't all get on the same page. Here's an approach that works reasonably well for everybody. Let's get this done. And so I think Abbott and Phelan would like to signal to Patrick, this hand has been dealt. Take it or leave it. And we'll see if he's willing to do that.
And my last question to you is, what is the potential impact on the Republican Party here in Texas and just Republicans in general when you have the big three, the top three Republican leaders in the state not on the same page on an issue that is so critical to Texans?
It certainly does not bode well for the Republicans' future prospects. I mean, look, the Republican Party in Texas is strong and will remain strong. They're in a powerful electoral position. But infighting and factional division can only undermine that. For one thing, I think it definitely sets up more primary battles within the party in the 2024 cycle. You could very well see these factions going after each other in a variety of state House, state Senate races, and maybe in terms of some statewide races. Democrats are certainly happy to see it. I mean, Democrats have been the minority party in Texas for a long time now, and any cracks in the facade of Republican unity can only help Democratic prospects. Republicans have to know that. They have to realize that from a political standpoint. They don't have as much luxury to be divided now as they did 10 or 15 years ago. 10 or 15 years ago, their position was so dominant in the state that divisions, frankly, didn't really matter. They could just steamroll the Democrats. They're not in that kind of position now. Democrats are clearly the minority party, but they have a puncher's chance to win elections. And Republican divisions just make that more plausible. So I think it is a political problem for the statewide Republican Party.
SMU Political Science Professor Matthew Wilson, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate your insight.